Well, mass rallies have been held across Europe in solidarity with asylum seekers escaping war and execution, while counter-demonstrations also took place in 3 Eastern European capitals. Nearly 90,000 Britons attended rallies dubbed Solidarity with Refugees in the capital, London. The Danish capital, Copenhagen, some 30,000 people staged a similar rally as the government plans to tighten immigration laws. Similar protests have been held in Italy, France, Germany, Sweden, Portugal, Hungary, Greece, Austria and a number of other European countries. Rival groups also staged counter-demonstrations in the Czech Republic, Poland and Slovakia after their government opposed an EU scheme to fix refugee quotas. The anti-refugee protesters chanted slogans against Islam. The European Union's 28 members are due to meet on Monday to discuss a quota system for distributing 160,000 refugees around the bloc.
It was a Saturday of action in London. Newly appointed Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn's first order of business was to address the tens of thousands gathered to protest the treatment of refugees by European governments, including Britain's. There had been growing anger to the British response as thousands attempted to make the perilous journey to Europe.
The pernicious racism that has come out from David Cameron to label people desperately fleeing war and destitution as a swarm or as a problem is misplaced and is breaking international law by not allowing refugees safe asylum.
Large-scale demonstrations like this, in fact, things that have become movements in the United Kingdom, are bound to be giving the Prime Minister food for thought, because it's one thing for David Cameron to be spouting a tough stance on refugees on the international and some say domestic stage, but when in his own backyard people are saying entirely the opposite when it comes to government policy, well, the Prime Minister may need to climb down sooner rather than later. Protesters were keen to point out government policy did not reflect the public mood.
The government isn't doing enough at the moment. It's saying it'll do a little bit, but it's dragging its feet. It won't do very much. And we have to say that we want them to do more.
We believe that the UK should be leading the way and upholding the humanitarian standards and supporting as many refugees as possible.
We claim all this moral basis, that we're this moral agent in the world for moral good. But when the world actually needs us, our response is that we want to now bomb Syria. Before we bomb Syria, how about we take the refugees in, give them a place to live, give them some safety, security. Do you know what I mean? Bombing doesn't ever bring about peace.
We're taking far too few people who are seeking international protection. This government is one of the most privileged countries in the world, and we're just not doing enough.
The hope now is the message from the streets meets the ears of the policymakers. Until then, demonstrators say, they'll simply be back until Britain steps up to the plate and stops playing politics with vulnerable lives. Amina Taylor, Press TV, London.
Well, we're joined by journalist and political commentator Ronan Burtonshaw from Dublin to shed more light onto this story. Thank you very much, Ronan, for joining us. Well, what can be understood from these rallies is that Europe is pretty much divided when it comes to the refugee crisis. We've got countries like Germany, which have been exemplary, they've been very welcoming, and then we've got Eastern European countries that have been openly unwelcoming, Islamophobic and even racist. Given that this burden, just like Angela Merkel suggested, should be shared among all European member states, then how should this situation be resolved?
I think it's important to say that it's not simply Eastern Europe that has had this problem. Of course, Germany had the Pegida movement, which was expressly Islamophobic and anti-immigrant. France has the Front National, which is doing very well in the polls. And there are also anti-immigrant movements in other countries like UKIP and Britain and so on. There is a divide in Europe, there's no question about that. Today was the side of one particular part of that divide, which is over 150 locations around Europe, including every capital in the European Union, had refugees welcome demonstrations. These are people, enormous numbers of people, given the size of the racist backlash in the mainstream press and by an awful lot of governments. A lot of ordinary people came out to demonstrate their solidarity with refugees, to oppose racist stereotyping of refugees, and also to place a number of other demands to improve the system for asylum seekers in many European countries, and to end the war in Syria, which is driving so much of this crisis at the moment. So I think today was a very good day for progressive forces across Europe.
So, talking about these refugees, what has been blatantly ignored by the mass media is the reason why this crisis came to place in the first place. What do you think was the reason behind this crisis, and why is the media not making an effort to make aware the people of these countries that maybe their countries were actually behind all of this happening in the first place?
Yeah, I think that wars in the Middle East played an enormous part. Obviously, a lot of the refugees come from Syria. Not only Syria, you've also got refugees from Iraq and from Libya. It's important today with the election of Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party in Britain, as you've just seen, that anti-war voices are rising in Europe at the same time as this pro-refugee movement, pro-refugee rights movement is gaining in strength. I think that if we had one movement without the other, it would be lacking. But there are more and more connections being made from the grassroots. In Dublin today at the protest, and in Copenhagen actually where I was, there were very clear connections made between governments pursuing pro-war policies in the Middle East, destabilizing societies and leading to extraordinary amounts of violence, and the refugee crisis. I think that people should have a right to migrate regardless of those circumstances. I think that this is something that we're saying in Europe now. We should tear down the borders of Fortress Europe, which is dictating all kinds of different terms for people from outside Europe to come into Europe. I don't think we should be saying that people who come from positions of extreme poverty or maybe oppressive governments shouldn't have the right to migrate. But I think particularly we should focus on wars and what our own governments are doing to promote an agenda of war in the Middle East.
Thank you very much, Ronan Burtonshaw, journalist and political commentator, joining us from Dublin.